Uh, Good morning, class. Today we're going to discuss George Jackson's Blood in My Eye, Chapter 1. It's important to remember with Jackson that we're looking at a brilliant mind, a revolutionary that is trying to give us a sensibility of both the definition of revolution as well as the conditions that preceded and that are necessary for it to come about. I think one of the strengths of Blood in My Eye is that it's written as a prison manuscript. So you really do get to see the intellectual development and the processes by which political prisoners are thinking about their situation under a system of American segregation, apartheid, and domestic terrorism. Remember, this book is written during the 1970s. So what you see is an organic development of how George Jackson is thinking about the conditions of racism, the conditions of segregation, how that links up to imperialism, capitalism, etc. We often have a language that suggests to us that revolutionary consciousness is based on identity politics or progressivism. And I think that one of the interesting pieces of George Jackson is that he suggests to us that many ways that we speak about privilege and identity today doesn't get at the root cause at the organization of society. And that's what's important about his work. So don't think about this as a call for violence, a call for revolution. Think of it as the reflections upon what is necessary for us to truly get to a revolution that stops the violence of the American state or government, right? So let's begin at page 3. Uh, he begins with a letter to a comrade where he starts trying to break down what he thinks needs to happen for a revolution to take place. And he says that we've gone through approximately the same changes since they separated us. Right? Speaking to his comrade, the confused flight to national revolutionary Africa through the riot stage of revolutionary Black America, we have finally arrived at scientific revolutionary socialism with the rest of the colonial world. I was hoping that you wouldn't get trapped in the riot stage like a great many other very sincere brothers. And here's what's really important about what Jackson is trying to do. Jackson is suggesting that there are dialectical stages, there's back and forth developments in how revolutionary consciousness is birthed. And that what we often do, and this has been very similar criticism I've waged in my work, especially in regards to Black Lives Matter, is we invent and we pause the moment of revolutionary consciousness so that it looks like something we saw in the 1960s. What Jackson is suggesting is that you move to revolution through riots, right? Through the development of ideas like revolutionary socialism. Or if you're Huey P. Newton, you're going to get to a place of intercommunalism. These kinds of changes are necessary because this is how revolutionary consciousness and action grows. So that's why he says that we've arrived at scientific revolutionary socialism with the rest of the world, because he doesn't see it just as blacks against whites. He sees a global movement of how the oppressed are facilitating their own freedom, in Africa and Cuba, etc., around South America. What's important about this moment is that this is the same conclusion that Martin Luther King comes to, and where do we go from here? So whereas King says the civil rights movement in the United States is not just an American movement, it's a worldwide movement of which America is just a small part. You see the same kind of perception, the same kind of idea in how George Jackson is looking at this development in his work as well. That's to say, do not make the mistake of believing that it's only revolutionary thinkers are Black radicals in the sense of militancy or the Black Panther Party that are looking at world revolutions. Even people who we today would consider somewhat conservative or on the more moderate progressive side of things like Martin Luther King also saw a worldwide movement as the basis of American civil rights movement and Black human rights. That's important because it suggests that what you're looking at in America with Black people, with radical Black thinkers, is a small piece of the pie, so to speak. You're looking at the snapshot or case study of how revolutionary consciousness grows within this geography. At the bottom of 3, he says, at times I wonder about the present state of revolutionary Black consciousness. It's really annoying to hear Blacks express right-wing traditionalist political ideas. I mean, you get the same spiel that you get from Wallace, Maddox, Hearst, or Hunt coming from Black people like Lomax, Young Bunch, some recently dead now, thanks to the forces of good. You must teach, and this is the next paragraph on page 4, that socialism, communalism is as old as man, that its principles form the basis of mostly all the East African cultures. There was no word to denote possession in the original East African tongues. The only independent African societies today are socialistic. Those which allow capitalism to remain are still neo-colonies. Any Black who would defend an African military dictatorship is as much a fascist as Hoover. Are you aware of how the people are living under those so-called African fascist cultures? Now, why is this distinction important? George Jackson is suggesting that the communalism, right? And I urge you to think about this, because remember, in relationship to how you think about Huey P. Newton, his notion of intercommunalism, they argue that that basis of social engagement and relation is fundamentally African. So unlike whereas you're going to get Marxist analysis throughout this text, you will also get the idea that the end goal, the communism, so to speak, is fundamentally African and fundamentally invested in African mores and thinking. Since you don't have this kind of thought that's coming from a unique European venue, right? Because the way that you trace it in European thought is from Marxism and the idea of giving up individualism to an ideal of communism. Jackson is starting from the presupposition, from the assumption that African societies were organized on pure relationships, right? On more communal forms of existence than European forms would allow for. Now, what I would suggest is in reading this that you really take a step back to think about the difference between reading European trajectories of thought versus African/Africana trajectories of thought. George Jackson is not making the argument based on idealism. He is not making the argument that people who want to have a revolution should simply think themselves into it. And that's what I think we get when we talk about Marx, right? When we talk about Marx, we are talking about this could possibly happen if we make certain assumptions about human nature. But when we think about what African societies are actually doing, we see that there's a much more fundamental relationship between how they're organized and what actually existed. So Jackson is saying these kinds of relationships actually existed. And this is the basis by which the Black colony and the revolutionary consciousness of Black people will naturally grow. So this is part of the argument that he's using to situate something that Africa is trying to do. And you see this on page 5, right? This isn't so much about the racial uniqueness. This is about history. So when he says that some of the arguments that people pose sit around the despondent cliche that Africa will invent something unique, it won't be arrangements in the egalitarian method. Egalitarianism is people's government, and people's government and economics is socialism, dialectical, and materialist. How else can they be governed? So you see what he's trying to set up for you here. He's saying, look, in the hall of human history, you've had either capitalist exploitative economies that have not taken the humanity and the relationship between humans seriously. And on the other hand, You've had the organization of economic trade relationships based on egalitarianism, but that egalitarianism is based in the relationship that people have to each other, which is why it's socialistic, dialectic, and materialist in the sense that it looks at the actual conditions that are growing between people throughout history. Now, while we may be able to disagree with that, right? We could always disagree with the organization. Think about how Jackson is thinking through this. He's saying that, look, if East Africa and East African culture has historically been more egalitarian than what Europe has been doing, then when you point to the end of revolution, the ideal is situated in the history of relations that Africa's already had to each other. And this is going to substantiate his point later in terms of why the Black colony, why Black revolutionary consciousness, right? On page 6, he suggests that the greatest forms of egalitarianism, of course, came from Africa. He says, then, comrade, you will encounter the faint-hearted and illogical types like Ali Clay, entertainer and tool of the capitalist cliches, or capitalist cliques. Their line is, ain't nobody but Black folks gonna die in a revolution. This argument completely overlooks the fact that we always have done most of the dying and still do. Died at the stake through social neglect or in U.S. foreign wars. The point is to now construct a situation where someone else will join in the dying. If it fails that we have to do the most of the dying anyway, we certainly know worse off than before. And I think that this is a really important point that many people don't understand in the call for revolution. Under our political climate, the idea of being anti-white or just saying kill white people has become the propaganda slogan of the alt-right and white supremacists. The assumption is that people who argue or discuss political violence or revolution within the historical context of people's ideas, especially Black people's ideas and the ideas of the oppressed, simply believe that you should kill white people, people with white skin. But they overlook the reflection and the kind of attention that people like George Jackson are paying to the fact that in revolutions, the oppressed die as well. And how that reality of the oppressed dying as well is placed in line with the reality that the oppressed are dying now. So the nature of revolution for these thinkers is such that death is the component of Black life, which is why in my work, for example, I talk about Black life as dying, right? But what happens if you're dying now, then do you continue to die, or do you die and act against the relationships and the organizations and the corporations and the governments, right? And the white people, the segregationists that are fundamentally committed to making that dying continue. George Jackson is saying that, listen, if the argument is if you have a revolution, Black people are going to die, he's saying that's non-unique. That's not unique to anything. It's not like Black people are vibrant and living today. That's the problem of racism. But if you're going to say, well, we have to evaluate whether the struggle for liberation will involve more or less dying, perhaps different ideas, perhaps a different world, then that's what Jackson is trying to compel the thinker and the reader to do. The kind of political reactionism, the kinds of reactions that you're getting from the alt-right, from white supremacists that suggest that political violence is never necessitated for the oppressed, but simultaneously the endorsement of violence by those groups to maintain or show and demonstrate their demographic and political superiority is a contradiction of terms. What George Jackson is saying is that that is how white supremacists and capitalistic orders stay in power, that you intimidate, that you make afraid, that you kill to demonstrate the power that the organization and the repressive fascist regime has over the daily lives of the oppressed and the exploited. So there is no other point of revolutionary consciousness, and we'll talk about this in some of the later pages. But where he talks about, in order to embrace revolution, you have to open up the possibilities. You can't simply work through the already pre-established system, right? And this is why he talks, says specifically on page 6, that that's why we're forced into a re-examination of the whole nature of Black revolutionary consciousness and its relative standing within a class society steeped in a form of racism so sensitive that it extends itself even to the slightest variation in skin tone. Now, the important point here is that he understands that Black people basically reject racism, right? As a characteristic of their nature, of the way that they move and relate to individuals through the world, they reject racism. He says that they've never found it to be expedient, wise, or honorable to take on the characteristics of the enemy. I think that it is vitally important to stress that for Blacks, a concern for the survival of the race is not patently definable as racism, right? So here again, he makes the same argument that Stokely Carmichael's making in Black Power, that a focus and love of Black people is not fundamentally anti-white, but the nature of whiteness, the power dynamics of whiteness have to be thoroughly investigated so that you understand why you get the social phenomena that you're getting today. Said differently, you can say, I love Black people, and study what oppresses Black people. And in the study of Black people, come up with the idea that whiteness, white supremacy, and white violence oppress Black people. That is an analytic consequence of studying the conditions that oppress Black people. It is not an ideological a priori consideration that simply asserts that white people are bad. And that's a distinction. George Jackson is trying to analyze the structures of racism, the structures of capitalism, the structure of imperialism, and thereby comes to the conclusion, right, that whiteness and class exploitation and false consciousness are fundamentally involved in how we think about racism as a social phenomenon and structurally organized in society. So how then does Jackson think of Black people? So this is page 7 and 8. For Black people living within this kind of racist class structure, the slave becomes his word of choice. He says, as a slave, the social phenomenon engages my whole consciousness is, of course, revolution. And this is going to be important because later in the book, he says that the position of the slave necessitates revolution. Right? That once you admit you're a slave, then revolution is the only thing that you could hope for or aim for or dedicate your life to, such that you can attain any notion of freedom. So he says this, he says, the slave and revolution, born to a premature death, a menial subsistence, wage worker, odd job man, the cleaner, the caught, the man under hatches without bail. That's me, the colonial victim. So for him, the colonial victim and the slave are synonymous. Anyone who could pass the civil service examination today can kill me tomorrow. Anyone who passes the civil service examination yesterday can kill me today with complete immunity, right? So he's talking about the ways in which cops operate, right? And they have the power to dispose of the colonial victim. I live with repression every moment of life, a repression so formidable that any movement on my part can only bring relief, a respite of small victory or the release of death. Now notice here, right? Notice here what Jackson's doing. Jackson is saying that the conditions of life are so horrible, are so repressive, are so anti-Black that death brings about release. And this is what I'm saying, that he accepts that under this kind of industrial, capitalist, and racist society, that the position of the slave is spiritually and humanistically vacuous, that there's nothing there. He's owned, he's property. So revolution breathes life into the existence that he has today within the order of the anti-Black society that he suffers under. Now, some people may say, well, that just seems pessimistic. It seems hard to believe that society can be organized in such a way that this is how people think about it. Well, I would say to those people, well, then how do you understand the relationships that we've endured, that oppressed people have endured in America? So what do you expect to be the temperament of indigenous people who have suffered generations of genocide, poverty, and alcoholism? What do you think will be the temperament of the incarcerated, Black and brown men specifically? What do you think will be the attitudes and personalities of groups of people who endured slavery, Jim Crow, and then segregation even today? There has to be a kind of sensitivity, a kind of nuance to the actual consequences of oppression and the consequences that oppression have for human psychology. I simply don't believe that we look at that when we talk about oppression today. We're much, much more comfortable thinking of, oh, people couldn't do X, but we don't think the consequences. We don't think of what that relationship looked like. If you can't cross the street because it's a different neighborhood and it was a white neighborhood, if you can't shop at a grocery store, if you don't have medical care, if you can't go to the dentist because the dentist only serves white people, if you can't go to a restaurant, what kind of psychology does that put on the oppressed? What is the burden of their oppression, right? And this is why he says ultimately that revolution within this kind of society can only mean the overthrow of all existing property relations and the destruction of all institutions that directly or indirectly support existing property relations. It must include the total suppression of all classes and individuals who endorse the present state of property relations and who stand to gain from it. Anything less than this is reform. So now he's moved into defining what is the necessary conditions, criteria, components of revolution. What does he say? He says at the top of page 8 that government and the infrastructure of the enemy capitalist state must be destroyed to get at the heart of the problem. Property relations. Otherwise, there is no revolution, right? So you can't just reorder. You know, people say, oh, I want to work on things from the inside. No, for Jackson, you can't just reorder the configurations of power. Property relations, the delineations between the poor, people who own factories, the corporations. These things create the logics that allow you to say that worker is worth less than this worker, that this individual is worth less than this individual. He says that property relations, who owns who produces who, economic relations, homes, property, land, etc., must be completely reconfigured. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is to destroy the government, right? And the infrastructure of the capitalist state. For him, this does not mean that the people who are at the bottom simply replace the people at the top. Revolutionary change, according to Jackson, means the seizure of all that is held by the 1% and the transference of these holdings into the hands of the remaining 99%. If the 1% are simply displaced by another 1%, revolutionary change has not taken place. So he's saying that as slaves, right, people who are owned, we understand that ownership and the machines of distribution must be reversed. So he's arguing that you can't just create another relationship of capital. You can't simply say the oppressed will now own things. The oppressed will now occupy the top positions of corporations. He's like, that is a kind of reformism that does not displace the logics or structures that oppress people in the first place. And this is vastly important. I mean, think about it. We see all these arguments about, replacing Trump. When Occupy Wall Street was going on, it was about, people, the 99% versus the 1% of the country. When you evaluate that, when you look at that, was it really a revolutionary consciousness? Was the fight or the disdain of middle-class white people enough to not reinvent capitalism? Or was this just an argument? Was this just their dissent, their outrage at being lessened down the socioeconomic peg of the economy? Was this their inability to cope with the fact that they would not be centered as the first and primary beneficiaries of their white privilege, right? I mean, I think that these are legitimate questions that are far too often ignored, if not outright overlooked. That, well, people are marching in the streets. So what? What are they demanding, right? What are they asking for? What's the revolutionary consciousness of the middle-class white population? I used to say in class all the time, before it was taken out of context, of course, that when Occupy Wall Street was going on, I used to turn on the TV to watch the police assault the middle-class white people, to see them get beat in the head with batons. And I said that the instructive aspect of seeing this is that it's the first time that white America had to understand that their whiteness would not protect them from the organization of capital in society. That whereas most white Americans, middle-class white Americans, experience the police as safeguarding their whiteness in their neighborhoods, their suburbias, right, from Black and brown people. Now you have white people getting beat upside the head with batons by police because they were attacking Wall Street. and the billionaires there. So the police attack the white people who they generally protect from brown people to protect the rich, the millionaires who organize the ruling class, the millionaires who organize the economic and property relations in society. And I said that that's a racial awakening. That one of the benefits of seeing that on television, of an America seeing the police beat white people, is that it flips the way that we think of the logics of the police. The police are not there just to protect all whites. They're there to protect rich whites and the system of capitalist reproduction, or the capitalist of production, which is inevitably a system of reproduction, right? And people got outraged by that, because they're like, oh, it's anti-white. But no, it's showing that there's a development of racial consciousness, that white people now see that their whiteness is delineated, that there are different types of white people in America. There are different types of white people who hold property and don't hold property. And that the threat of them not holding property is what racialized them. It's what put them in the same boat as black and brown people. And that's why it was so easy to break up Occupy Wall Street, because they put the wretched, the damned of the world next to these middle-class white people. And they dispersed, they dispersed quickly, because the white people who were middle-class and upset that they were going to become poor didn't want to deal with or align with the poor, right? And this is a tremendous intervention. This is why on page 9, George Jackson is saying that the problem of the black colony and the brown colony, those are the entire 99% who are being manipulated, could never be redressed as long as the necessary resources for their isolation are the personal property of the extraneous minority motivated solely by the need for its own survival. And the extraneous minority will never consider the proper solutions, right? So we have to think about that. That's why George Jackson is saying, to be a slave, to be the slave, revolution is an imperative, a love-inspired conscious act of desperation. It is aggressive. It is not cool or cautious. It's bold, audacious, violent, expression of icy, disdainful hatred. It can hardly be any other way without raising a fundamental contradiction. If revolution, and especially revolution in America, is anything less than an effective attack or defense weapon and a charger for the people to mount now, is meaningless to the great majority of the slaves. And here Jackson makes a very important intervention into, well, what is the idea of the slave? Why revolution? Why not politics? Well, he says that the slave is always expecting death. Remember, the slave is disposable. The slave could be killed by any person that plays that passes the civilian service test. So that's why Jackson is saying, and this is his quote on page 10, if revolution is tied to dependence on the inscrutabilities of long-range politics, it cannot be made relevant to the person who expects to die tomorrow. And this is the precarious situations of blacks. You see the same kind of eschatological reflection in the works of King, in the works of X, in the works of Huey P. Newton, Revolutionary Suicide. The argument was doing the work of race, especially for black men, meant death. So what is long-range politics? What is the idea that the world's going to change in 15, 20 years do for people who are dying? And again, this brings us back to the great contradiction of arguing against revolution, in which people have said, well, too many people have died. People are dying now. People are incarcerated now. The police are killing people now. The bombers in Austin are killing people now. What does it mean for how we think about race and racism when the people that we claim that we're protesting and sympathetic with are dying? And this is the great metaphysical problem of the arguments for liberalism. It's dependent on black death. And this is why Afro-pessimism, despite my disagreement with it, has so much cachet in the psychology of oppressed black people. It's not because the metaphysics of the position is absolutely right, but it's because it speaks to this contradiction in civil discourse and liberal political thinking, democratic theory. Namely, that the idea that black people should somehow discuss things or believe in democracy or pull themselves up from the bootstrap is rooted primarily in the idea that they have time. And what George Jackson is saying is that, no, you don't have time. That the realities of oppression, the realities of racism is such that you will die. You could die tomorrow by any white person that's disgruntled with you. So he says that there could be no rigid time controls attached to the process that um, offers itself as relief, not if those for whom it principally is intended are under attack now. If the proponents of revolution cannot learn to distinguish and translate the theoretical into the practical, if they continue to debate just how to call up and harness the conscious motive forces of revolution, the revolutionary ideal will be the loser. It will be rejected. But this is why he thinks that the black colony or oppressed black people in America are so important, right? He says that the principal reservoir of revolutionary potential in America lies in wait inside the black colony. Its sheer numerical strength, its desperate historical relation to violence of the productive system, and the fact of its present status in the creation of wealth forces the black stratum at the base of the whole class structure to the forefront of every revolutionary scheme, right? So he says that the black colony can and will influence the fate of things to come. It's the impact of black revolutionary rage that can actually carry some of the opening stages of the socialist revolution, because the people at the bottom, which are black people, certainly have a stake, have something to say about the orientation that revolution takes in order to overthrow property relations, because they have been the people who have for the longest been owned. And again, people, this is not to say that other groups, and we'll see this a little later, right? This is not to say that it's an all-black revolution. He's talking about the people or the group of people that will bring about revolutionary consciousness from the oppressed all the way through. So what does that mean? Like, why? And this is an important point. So when we hear about George Jackson, when we hear about the Panthers, why do we not hear about this care, this system of thinking and thought? The reason is that when we look at radical black thinking, the way that white supremacists and liberals depict it is as irrational racial rage. So when you see someone say, well, the discussions about political violence or revolutionary violence or killing whites or killing the dominant group has been a tradition in black thought, what they're saying is that this has been something thought about as a means to organize the revolutionary potential of oppressed groups throughout societies, throughout the world. The reality is that Europeans have created systems of economics, government, and ideology that have justified what they claim to be as their racial superiority or their racial birthright. What other system of politics can you have that does not take that organization serious, or does not take the role that political violence has and plays in socializing people into fear, into acquiescence? How can you talk about revolution outside of the ways that violence is used to keep people in line? Jackson is saying that you have to break out of that thinking and take whatever consequences may happen. Revolution will be violent, but violence is endemic to the system of oppression that you're fighting against, right? So one of the things that happened with George Jackson is that he had a little brother named Jonathan, and Jonathan Jackson organized a riot, a revolt, or armed taking of a government agency, and I want us to look on page 11 to see what he said about that. He says that we're quite obviously faced with a need to organize some small defenses to the more flagrant abuses of the system now, right? And notice how now is emphasized, right? This goes back to how he thinks now the present is important. He says, I mean this in a military sense. The period of disorganized activity of riots and rallies and purely political agitation and education has come to a close. The violence of the opposition has brought it to an end. We cannot raise consciousness another millimeter without a new set of tactics. Long-range political ploys alone are not practical for us. To me, the concept seems to assume that someday in the distant future, we'll produce a 700-pound flea to fight the paper tiger. It's not too likely to happen. While we await the precise moment of capitalism's victims will indignantly rise to destroy the system, we're being devoured in family lots at the whim of this thing. There will be no super slave. Some of us are going to have to take our courage in hand and build a hard revolutionary cadre for selective retaliatory violence. We have numbers on our side if the whites who support revolutionary change can prevent this thing from degenerating into a race war. The picture of the United States as a paper tiger is quite accurate, but there is a great deal of work to be done on its destruction, and I'm not of the opinion if there is a big job of growing to do. The sooner begun, the sooner done. What do you say? I guess would be my response. What do you say to this idea of the world, right? That people, and I want y'all to think about this because I think that this resonates so richly with the moment that we're in today in American society. The people who are being oppressed, who are being killed, are the same people who are asking for equality. But the call for equality gets you killed. Not violence, but equality. You die because you claim that you want equality, humanity. And that is being denied by a racist presidency, a racist society, a racist group of people. Yet, when you make that call for equality, they attack you as if your call for equality is anti white. So you can't be equal to whites without offending whites. And if that is in fact the case, then do you simply say that moral equality is better than self defense or retaliatory violence? How does this work for the oppressed? If you die from saying you want to be nonviolent and equal, and you die from saying that you want to be equal, but will use violence to preserve, to justify and protect your rights, what's the difference? You die in both cases. And I think that his explanation of Jonathan and the question of how we understand the relationship between time and racial oppression is so rich and so interesting because it really does resonate with what we're dealing with today. You know, I remember teaching, I started as a young professor when Obama was elected. And I remember, the hope that students, professors, pundits all across America had. And I was the one saying, well, no, this is a false hope because the response to this reaction throughout American history has been woefully negative. And people were saying, oh, you're pessimistic, X, Y, and Z. But then we have Trump. And now we have white supremacists. We have a rollback of civil rights. We have deportation of Black people and brown people. We have the demonization of Muslims. We have the falling of the economy. Right? How is this not a direct response to the attack on what many whites in America felt to be the disruption of governance in America? We often fail to investigate the consequences of the ideas or the symbols that we believe in. We believe in Obama, in racial equality, and we don't connect how that value, once brought into the world, will cost people lives and cost people their livelihoods. This is why I'm 12. Jackson says, in order to develop revolutionary consciousness was to learn how revolutionary consciousness can be raised to the highest point by stimuli from the vanguard elements, right? And this is not what we do, right? When Obama won, right? This is the pinnacle of the elite position. We haven't changed the way that groups of people think on the ground. We recognize and appreciate the decades of hard, sometimes dangerous work done in the name of revolution by the older socialist parties. Perhaps we wouldn't exist at all if it were not for their efforts. Our sincere wish is to operate in complete harmony with these other people. We must create a new impetus and greater intellectual and physical energy if the forces of reaction are not to win another extended reprieve, right? So what is he talking about? What is he talking about? Well, he's saying that if you don't create systems, right? And this is a really good point with the alt-right and the Tea Party. If you don't create systems and consciousness in people that recognize the structure of the society itself from the position of the people at the groups at the bottom, then you leave yourselves open to the radicalization of forces that are going to try to enforce the status quo. The alt-right didn't appear because they were just underground. They appeared because they saw now that the status quo aligns with their interests, and they felt emboldened by it, emboldened by white supremacists and white supremacy to actually come out and demonstrate why their ideological position and platform is in line with the dominant forces of the government, namely Trump, right? And this is what George Jackson is trying to say, that if you don't have an ideological or epistemic structure that identifies what oppression is and what exploitation is, then inevitably you're going to reinvent the wheel, because those people socialized by the status quo to protect the means of production, to protect the racial order, are going to become very adamant that they have a right to do so. And this is the situation that we found ourselves in America today, right? Um, and this is why he quotes Lenin's guerrilla warfare, right? New forms of struggle unknown to the participants of a given period inevitably arise as the given social situation changes. The coming crisis will introduce new forms of struggle that we're now unable to foresee. Now, why is this common on our present time? Because we're not fighting the alt-right with new forms of struggle. We're not trying to reorganize for a truly democratic society with new forms of struggle. We're constantly trying to reinvent the reformist ideology that keeps in the types of ideas and the types of memories and the types of behaviors and patterns of thinking and behaving, right? That justify the status quo. And see, and this is the danger. See, the danger is not saying kill white people. The danger is what is the basis of oppression that keeps all these people oppressed, including white people? And why are some white people willing to die to protect their racial heritage and what they take to be their racial legacy? And black and brown people and some revolutionary white people are willing to die for the notion of freedom and overthrowing capitalism and the segregationist logics of the American order. That's the question. You see, they want us to have hashtag perspectives on how we think about revolution and revolt. The idea is, oh, we'll just educate people out of racism, but that doesn't work. Oh, we'll just protest, but that doesn't work. You shoot people. Oh, we'll just demonstrate, but then you arrest people and then you call them black identity terrorists. You see, the issue is how do you protect the status quo? And if that means a moral discourse, an ethical discourse, an academic discourse that makes the status quo appear to be normalized and the best bang for the buck, so to speak, then everything that falls outside of that parameter is inevitably going to be demonized, condemned, and called immoral. So what black people have historically been fighting for has not simply been political violence, has not simply been revenge. It's been about a reorganization of the ways that we think about and talk about how we get to revolutionary consciousness. And that's a very, very important point, right? Very, very important point that you can't simply reduce everything. You can't reduce everything to, revenge or political motivations. I think you see this again on page 42 and 43. Where he says building consciousness and revolutionary culture against the repressive natural defense reflexes of the system means taking realistic day-to-day issues like hunger, the need for clothing and housing, joblessness. It invokes provoking repression, feeding on it. The fact of political and political economic prisoners and legions and the processes used by the oppressors to judge and condemn them must be used as the rallying cries of revolution. Economic crime and crimes of passion against the oppressors must be understood as rebellion. Even funerals can be used as an issue since there will be so many of them, right? He accepts death. Improvising on reality is the key principle underlying the building of a united left and raising the conscience of a people. It will give us our tactics. In the Black colony and other depressed areas of the country, there will be less difficulty in organizing, mobilizing, and altering the attitudes of the people toward their class enemies. However, in the areas of the class structure that can be said to be making it, affecting attitudes towards a revolutionary change in the system of production and distribution will, of course, call for the destruction of their comfort, the manufacturing of a condition where it will be either neutral or complementary or complementary to the revolutionary effort. So you see that George Jackson is thinking about this, right? He's thinking about the effects of consciousness, the effects of killing people, the effects of disappointment, the effects of economic deprivation and poverty. Like this is what he's saying is in fact the juice, the fuel behind changing the consciousness, right? And then we'll see later in the book that he actually makes an argument about what revolutionary consciousness is and how it's about understanding the structures of the world that we live in. But Jackson is trying to show us that there can be no piecemeal kind of reform. If you move with me to page 54 and 55. Jackson is saying that the whole ideological structure, the cohesion of the United States government and corporation capitalists have to be destroyed. And this is not just overthrow the government. This is those types of engagements with George Jackson's work and his ideas really don't do them justice. They're motivated by a kind of racist simplicity, which would have every white person in America believe that black people who are fighting for freedom ultimately just hate white people. There is some of that language there, given the segregationist tone of the times of what black people are fighting for. But overwhelmingly, the works of black people, from Stokely Carmichael and Black Power to George Jackson, as you're reading and seeing here, to Huey P. Newton, has been how do you revolutionize groups of people? And this is why I'm so woefully distrustful of intersectionality, which suggests that there are coalitional partners that are based in language and the will towards another group. These people are not trying to fundamentally change and alter society, given a specific consciousness and orientation through their activism throughout history. When you're talking about intersectionality, you're largely talking about coalitional built movements, largely led by women and feminists who see patriarchy and their class position as protection from violence. The violence that they're talking about are descriptive of the system. They're not talking about reactionary or retaliatory violence that the system has against them, because their gender position and their class position makes retaliatory violence almost an impossibility. The government is not going out killing white women who are protesting the right to vote. The government's not even killing black women of the upper classes who are protesting for their right for survival. But they are killing poor black and brown men overwhelmingly, and they do sometimes kill poor black and brown women and children. So the organization of how they see violence is completely different. This is why on page 55, George Jackson is saying, listen, you have to transcend the intellectual inhibitions that preclude support of at least a minimal level of violence that must develop concomitantly with each political thrust. Our attitudes must change before we can expect any response from the people, workers, students, and lumpen proletariat. And the cause for this is basically just what I said. He says on page 55 that we have to stop allowing ourselves to be hunted and doing some stalking of our own. Their secret police aren't really too secret at all. Right now, we can go numbering, naming, compiling information on all of them. They're too visible to be safe. Revolution is aggressive. So Jackson conceptualizes a fight between the oppressed black and brown colonies and white proletariat and the systems, the organizations of the state, et cetera, that are protecting the property and protecting the government. You can't get away from that. That is how Jackson is, in fact, describing the world. And if what Jackson assumes is, in fact, the case, then a conflict between the two, to a certain extent, are inevitable, unless you accept dehumanization and oppression as just the natural and dominating forces of the system, or of the existence of black and brown people and folk. But some people, of course, would say, well, that's not very practical, right? Because they have all the guns. Well, Jackson isn't exactly talking about just a full-fledged race war. This is not what he's doing. If you look to page 59 with me, you see that Jackson is making a very different and nuanced kind of argument. He's saying that in order for the oppressed to win against the system, against the oppressor, that many of these ideas are going to have to take the form of urban people's guerrilla warfare. And he thinks that this may be even more effective type of battle, of strategy, of warfare, than just the flat out classical forms of war that happen in the colonies, right? That you see what, I guess, Fanon talking about, or Fanon bringing about. What Jackson is trying to get you to push forward, or getting the reader of the book to push forward, is the way in which order and law necessitates the cohesion, or better says, enables the cohesion of a particular society. What he's doing is trying to suggest that we need to fight for perfect disorder. So this is the bottom of 59. He says the enemy culture, the established government, exists first of all because of its ability to govern, to maintain enough order to ensure that a cycle of sorts exists between various levels and elements of our society, right? So the cohesion, the role that the government plays, is that it creates an ideological parity between members of society that gives it consent to utilize its power in a particular way. This is why Huey P. Newton argued in the War Against the Panthers that the way that violence has been distanced from the hands of white vigilantes and the white public is that they give the government consent to utilize violence in their name for their own protection of sorts, right? So the law and order society creates both the consent, and it allows kind of the ideological similarity of those people rule to allow the government to do what it pleases. So this is why he says law and order is their objective. perfect disorder is ours. Our aim is to stop the life cycle of the enemy culture and replace it with our own revolutionary culture, right? So notice what he's doing. He's not saying that this is just the wills of force. He's saying that there has to be an ideological disruption in the level of consent and the level of order that's taken within a given society, in this case, America. He says this can only be done by creating perfect disorder within the cycle of enemy culture's life process and leaving a power vacuum to be filled by building a revolutionary culture. So part of what he's doing is he's trying to break up the cycle of the government bureaucracy and the ways in which government bureaucracy manufactures consent to the oppression of certain groups of people. And I think you've seen this even in our society today. What people are doing, what people are saying is that, listen, you know, when you're looking at what they're doing to Muslims, when you're looking at what they're doing to Mexicans and other immigrants, you're seeing fascism. And certain groups of white people in this country are in fact committed to letting that happen because it's not them, but what Jackson is saying, but it will be you because you've consented to a certain logics that allows this to happen without consequence, right? And this isn't a mistake, you know, Jackson's words. If you jump to 77 really quickly, you see that Jackson is very clear that armed struggle is at the heart of the revolution. That the problems of the people cannot be redressed because the necessary resources are in the hands of a relatively few families and individuals. It means that we're going to have to seize this property. Seizing property has always meant some form of war, some form of armed struggle. If history is our guide, it clearly records that nothing of any great value has ever changed hands without struggle, or at least a show of or threat of violence. Men simply don't surrender what they think of as their privilege and property except by force. History itself is economically motivated class struggle. So you can see the Marxism, right, in his argument. But what I would like to point you to really quickly is that this Marxism also gives away at a certain kind of intellectual growth of democracy, right? And you see this at the last page of what he's doing, where he says that that the reason that you're fighting for revolution is because of the dehumanization and the undemocratic nature of the status quo. He says, and listen to the call, listen to the final paragraph of the chapter. We can only be repressed if we stop thinking and stop fighting, right? So this is the struggle. People who refuse to fight, to stop fighting, can never be repressed. They either win or they die, which is more attractive than losing and dying. Notice the logic here. The primacy of politics remains, but we must now prepare for armed confrontation. By no stretch of the imagination can we hope to overthrow so determined an enemy without force. So George Jackson makes the argument that struggle, fighting against the system, has worth. And if you win and die, that you're doing so without living in the conditions of oppression where death is assumed and natural, and there is no human fire, no soul to engage beyond it. And this is the existential problem that I think Blackness points to. That, you know, when we often talk about Black existential philosophy, people want to talk about it in relationship to freedom and experience, right? And I think that that's short-ended. You have an infinite number of experiences of racism and what that tells you. But what have people been willing to see or to levy as the price paid for liberation? And that's where it gets interesting, because in reading Black men specifically, they were willing to fight for the liberation of their people through death, right? They were willing to die to fight for the lives and future of their people. So while they accepted, as George Jackson does, that the present commits them to death, right? That the politics must be immediate, that the politics must be now, and that force must be shown, you know, to overthrow the government, to overthrow the police, to overthrow the property owners and the owners of the means of production. They were willing to, they believed in freedom so much, so adamantly, that they were willing to die to bring it about. And I ask you seriously, what other philosopher have you read from the European tradition, the existentialist tradition, that was willing to pay for their choice with death? This is not the dilemma of Camus, who imagines the prisoner. This is the political prisoner who's incarcerated because they're fighting for liberation. And these are vastly different ways of thinking about the world. that is not usually taken up by the philosophical traditions of the West. So I would urge you in thinking through George Jackson, to thinking through some of the pieces of the chapter that we didn't get to, given that it's an 87-page chapter, that you think about these things. Think about the intellectual and deconstructive component of ideology and the formation of revolutionary consciousness. Jackson is arguing that we should understand the facts, the sociological and historical organization of society, and how that reality breeds about the conditions for revolution. Without that reality, without that acknowledgement, then you just have ideology, you have empty calls. The reason that revolutionary consciousness is scientific for Jackson is that it resonates with a certain reality of the world that can't simply be captured through identity or through intuition. And this is why it differs to the discourses that we have going on today. The discourses of today simply entertain that identity is the basis of how one believes in social relationships. Said differently, you need to know nothing about the actual environment that you're revolting in. You just have to know about the bodies and what you call them. That's an immature way of looking at history. It's an intellectually immature way of compiling society. It is the basis by which the bourgeois get to claim radicality, because they say that the revolution is in advancing them, not that is in breaking down the orders of the society such that their views, their thinking about the world is implicated in the actual social conditions of the world. So if you say, well, let's just give minorities affirmative action, that privileges the minorities who had the ability to go to college. It doesn't change the structures of the world that's preventing people from going to college. And then you thrust all the responsibility of going to college on the people who are saying that there are structural, material, institutional barriers of us going to college. So again, it continues to privilege a certain class of minorities. They're going to be much more sympathetic to reformism because they benefit from the system, rather than revolution. And Jackson's words are important. Again, you don't have to believe everything we read in the course, but the point of the course is to get you to think differently about what you take to be so obvious. If you start off with the idea that Black Panthers or Black militants or Black radical thinkers are violent, then you miss the function that they're both of the violence of the status quo of white supremacy, right? The nationalism of white supremacy, because we don't think of it as that. And the response that these oppressed people are trying to give to defend themselves and to liberate the rest of the world. You know, George Jackson is not just talking about Black people. He's talking about poor whites. He's talking about brown folks. He's not just giving you an analysis of racism. He's giving you an analysis of capitalism, of corporatism. He's not just thinking about political violence. He's also thinking about ideology, socialization, and consent. And to reduce all of that, to reduce his whole life corpus, his example to the world, to merely anger or rage, is a trick. It's a way to divest the intellectualism of Black political prisoners by maintaining that knowledge and revolutionary thinking has to take a certain form and be produced by a certain thinker. So we're fine with Kant, who's a racist that justified colonialism, being claimed as a revolutionary thinker in the history of the Western metaphysical tradition. But we balk at the fact that George Jackson was an actual political prisoner that fought for the liberation of Black and brown folk. We're comfortable reading Heidegger, who's a Nazi that wanted to kill Jews, as a deep thinker of philosophy. But we balk at George Jackson because he says we should use violence. But implicitly assumed in Heidegger's notions is that Jews will be exterminated through violence, right? Like we give the Western metaphysical tradition such a pass because it's built on genocide and violence. It doesn't have to announce it. And then we punish the oppressed when they announce the role that violence plays, both in their self-defense and as a mechanism to overthrow the ideological and political components of the world. And it's that double standard that I think says a lot about how we truly think about the intellectual productions of Black folk and Black people. So this lecture was basically trying to familiarize you with what George Jackson is trying to do in Blood in My Eye. It's trying to get you to see more clearly the ways in which George Jackson is trying to appeal to a certain kind of intellectual tactic, a certain kind of um, philosophical outlook on the structures of oppression during the 1970s. And it's trying to get you to see that what he's calling for is not just hateful, but how he sees what he sees to be the inevitable product of the repressive mechanisms of an American Western society. And like I said, agree with it or not, this is what George Jackson was thinking. This is what George Jackson wastes his life on. So it certainly deserves our intellectual attention. So thank you. And don't forget that we'll be taking on more Jackson later this week.